right, welcome. How's everyone doing today? You guys doing good this evening?
Yeah.
Right, hopefully. It's a good night. So this is our final Politics, Law, and Economics series provided by the Center for Free Enterprise and Entrepreneurship. It's always a great time here. I'm one of your hosts, Justin Haycock. I'm the director of the center. If you guys don't know me, come say hi, very friendly. And this is one of my favorite things that we do throughout our semester. This is the fourth one for it. We typically do one about every month. And we have a very special treat for you guys today. We brought someone from out of state, from Texas Tech, to talk about a very interesting topic around global sweatshops. And so without teasing it or telling you guys about it, I want to introduce our introductory host, Dr. Vincent Miozzi. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you, Justin. I'm really excited for this guest. It is my absolute honor to introduce Dr. Benjamin Powell. He is the executive director of the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech University, guns up, and a professor of economics in the Rawls College of Business, and a senior fellow with the Independent Institute. He is secretary-treasurer of both the Southern Economic Association and the Association of Private Enterprise Education, and the treasurer of the Mont Pelerin Society. He earned his BS in Economics and Finance from the University of Massachusetts at Lowell, and his MA and PhD in Economics from George Mason University. Dr. Powell is the author of Out of Poverty, Sweatshops in the Global Economy, now in its second edition, which we'll be discussing tonight. Co-author of Wretched Refuse, The Political Economy of Immigration and Institutions, and the Amazon best-selling book, and I believe it was the best-selling cookbook, is what it was classified as?
Beer book.
Beer book, yeah. Called Socialism Sucks, Two Economists Drink Their Way Through the Unfree World. But that's not all, right? Ben's done a lot, okay? He's the editor, co-editor of 5 other books. He's the author of more than 100 scholarly articles and policy studies, and those very studies and findings have been cited nearly 4,000 times in other scholarly studies and have been reported in hundreds of popular press outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and The Economist. He also writes frequently for those popular press outlets and has appeared on numerous radio and television shows, including Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, Showtime, CNBC, and he's a regular guest commentator on Fox Business's Freedom Watch and Stossel. You're going to pardon this long introduction. Okay, so on a personal note, right, it's actually a really cool, like, full circle moment for me. So the first time I actually introduced Ben was 6 years ago, okay, at Hillsdale College, when he was going to give a talk not on this book, but another one, when I was an undergrad, right, before I had even considered graduate school. And Ben is actually my dissertation advisor, so you have him to blame, my students that are here, for me, for suffering through my classes. So that's actually really cool that I get to introduce him now, not as a wee undergrad, but as a colleague, another student of the discipline, so to speak. So without further delay, I want to introduce Dr. Benjamin Powell, my mentor, my advisor, and my friend.
Thanks so much for a great introduction, and it's also fabulous as a professor to be able to come and visit someone who is your student and is succeeding so well and doing what he's doing here, along with Joe Connors, who was actually talking to us about this, that when I was a wee brand new assistant professor and Joe was debating switching careers when he was an engineer in California, took a class for me for his master's degree about 20 years ago. Yeah. And now has hired one of my other students, Vince, to work here. And it'd be awesome if one of the undergrads I meet here ends up at Texas Tech and becomes a professor and introduces me 6 years from now. But thank you all so much for being here tonight. And the topic I want to talk about today is the most recent edition of my book, Out of Poverty, Sweatshops and the Process of Development, or Sweatshops in the Global Economy, but talk about it in the process of development. So let's start. We'll do this a little bit interactive. Instead of just doing questions at the end, we'll kind of mix things up as we go. When I say sweatshops, what are the characteristics that make something a sweatshop?
Unsafe.
Let's take, what do you have?
Unsafe.
Unsafe working conditions. Okay, that'd be one of them. What else?
Long hours.
Long hours, wherever that was said. Yeah.
Low pay.
Low pay, at least by standards that we're used to in the United States. Other things, yes, sir?
Children working.
Child labor, yeah. Anything else? This is a pretty good list so far. See how it's, there we go. Oops. Didn't take you long to break that.
Just use the arrow keys.
That was the arrow key.
Oh, spacebar. There we go.
There we go.
Spacebar.
All right. So the one thing that you didn't say is forced labor, and I think that's important. So I'm going to talk about a lot of sweatshops today that have these conditions that you're talking about, of low pay, bad working conditions, long hours, unsafe ones, child labor. But they're all places where people choose to work. They choose to work there, admittedly, from a lousy set of options. Otherwise, they wouldn't choose to work in such a place. But that choice is important, both economically and I think morally. It indicates that those workers think that this is the least bad alternative available to them. Forced labor is different, and some people confuse these issues. There's one guy, Jim Keaty, he goes around and gives lectures at universities like this, and he wears a t-shirt that says slavery, and the V is a Nike swoosh. And I think this is doing a tremendous injustice to the millions of people who have actually been held in bondage and having to do forced labor around the world, both throughout history and still today. That's fundamentally different. If you have to use the threat of violence to get someone to work there, that's a strong indication that it is not your least bad alternative. For those situations, we do want to see those jobs disappear. But for people who work in sweatshops, while these jobs have all of the bad characteristics that we were just talking about, we want to make damn sure that we don't take away their least bad option. We make them better off by getting them more options. And unfortunately, I think a lot of things that people associated with the anti-sweatshop movement do would not give them better options, but would take away their least bad option. So anti-sweatshop movement is a mix of labor unions, AFL-CIO, Unite. I don't know if Florida, if your college has this or not, United Students Against Sweatshops. Is there a chapter on campus here?
Do not think so.
No, there definitely was at Florida State. They protested me when I went to talk there, which was great. Whenever someone protests me on campus, I get way more people to turn out. And the different groups argue for different policies, but as a kind of core group of things that they ask for, they tend to ask for a minimum or a living wage, which a living wage is a minimum wage, but tied to some local cost of living, improved safety and working conditions, unionization, enforcing whatever labor laws happen to exist, and almost universally condemn child labor. As one activist from Ohio State University put it, everybody wants to have a living wage, everyone wants to be able to take care of themselves and their family, everybody wants to retire and feel good, enjoy life, breathe, live, eat, you know, the regular shit. We ain't asking for anything extra special. And I tend to agree, they aren't asking for anything extra special. But the question is, does bullet point 2, does this group of policies deliver on a life that's a better life? Or will this undermine it and make their lives worse? So some people have characterized my work on this as a defense of sweatshops, and it is in a very particular sense, but it's not a defense of sweatshops that says, I'm an economist, I'm in favor of economic efficiency, and this is efficient. It's not one that, quote, puts profits over people or some stupid ass phrase like that. It's one that says, this is a means-ends analysis. I agree with the anti-sweatshop activists. For the purposes of this work, the welfare of sweatshop workers, and for that matter, potential sweatshop workers in poor countries around the world, that's the goal. The question is, what are the policies that will improve the welfare of these people, and what are things that are actually going to make them worse off? And I will argue that most of what you see, all of what you see on bullet point 2, actually is going to make them worse off, and there's other things that we should be pursuing instead if we want to try to make these people better off. So, if we are going to understand how we might help sweatshop workers, the first thing we have to understand is wage determination. What are the economic forces that determine sweatshop wages? So, let's play a game to start with. And I'm an economist, we know incentives matter. There's a prize for whoever wins this game. Unfortunately, it's just a copy of my book, so it's not much of an incentive, but it's what I could steal from the office as I was walking out. Let's say I could create $2 a day. Let's say all of you are factory owners, and all of you have apparel factories. I could create $2 a day of revenue for you in your firm by working for you. I don't think everybody has paper in front of them. We'll have to play this a little differently. That's okay. I want you all, here's how the game's gonna work. Whoever can make the most money off me working for them wins this game and this book. But I can only work for one of you. So, here's my situation. Right now, I'm on a subsistence farm. I earn the equivalent of 50 cents per day. But I would like to move and work in a factory, and you all have factories. I could create $2 a day of revenue for you. In econ speak, my marginal revenue product for you would be $2. What is the most you are willing to pay me? Or what are you willing to pay me? And whoever can get me to say yes to it and makes the most profit wins the game. That's how we're going to play. So pause for a sec, have a number in your head. Sir with a red hat is probably not Texas Tech on the back. What do you got?
Let's go with it.
It's not a long game, dude.
Yeah. Let's go with $10.
I could create $2 a day of revenue for you, and you're willing to pay me $10 a day?
Sold.
That's pretty.
I'm there, but you're losing $8 a day every day I work for you. This is not going to work out well. Back to business class. All right. What do you got? He just walked in. Oh, he just walked in. What do you got, sir?
I don't have $1.
$1? So he's willing to pay me $1 a day to work for him. Compared to my 50 cents on the subsistence farm, this seems better. But Owl Cafe's got his hand up. Do you have something better than $1 per day, sir? 51 cents. 51 cents?
He just did $1.
He just gave me $1. I'm not going to come work for you, dude. We got to work on this. Yes?
$1.95.
$1.95. I'm liking this. Did you have something different?
I was
No.
gonna say $1.75.
Does somebody have better than $1.95? Someone could win a book if they have better than $1.95.
$1.96.
$1.96. We're getting there, my friends. Where are we going? $1.99. Does anybody have better than that?
$2.
$2. Well, actually, technically, you don't make any profit off me, but that is the limit, right? Why is that the limit? Because at that point, any more than that, you lose money by hiring, right? So, by the way, you already have a copy of the book out here. So the upper bound, the maximum you're going to pay a worker, is limited by their productivity, or the amount they contribute to their profits. Marginal revenue product. Now, did you want to pay me $2? No, what would you like to pay me? $0, just pocket the $2, right? What prevents you from doing that? Not laws. What prevented you? There was no law in this classroom. What prevented you from $0?
You wouldn't work for me.
I wouldn't work for him because I already had $1.96 and $1.99, right? So this is how we determine our wages, right? Upper bound is going to be worker productivity. Lower bound is whatever their next best alternative is, or an econ speak opportunity cost. If we want to improve lives of sweatshop workers, it's got to be about moving these bounds. And the one that's really important to move is that upper bound. When we're talking about people who are at poverty living standards, it's not about the gap between $1.50 and $2 a day. It's about transforming the productivity so that you're not creating $2 a day in revenue, but creating $10, $20 a day in revenue. That's the getting out of poverty. That's the big one. About 85% of the variation of wages across countries is explained by productivity differences. So that's like why unionization is not really even a big part of this. Like at its best, that's about the bargaining range of getting you closer to the upper, but that's not about transforming your lives from poverty living standards to something much higher. And in fact, the number one way that unions do this is by excluding other people from entering the industry and competing with you, which when you're in a poor country and the sweatshops are a step up from ag, it means helping some workers and hurting even poorer ones. So it's really not a good way to do it. So it's gotta be about moving these bounds. If our policies are things that don't move these bounds, but legislate different things of compensation, then we're at the risk of unemploying some of the workers from their current least bad alternative. So things like minimum wages. How many of you all have taken a principles class? Principles of economics class. Good, most of you, right? You've all seen a minimum wage graph, creates unemployment. It's not really quite the same way to think about it in the third world. In third world countries, legislate a minimum wage. In the example that we just hit here of above $2 a day, it's going to result in me losing my job. But any minimum wage that you put in within a relevant range, you could do it where some workers keep their jobs, others lose their jobs. You don't get that little unemployment thing that you do when you probably did minimum wage in your principles class. Instead, if you're in the third world, virtually everybody works. So if you lose your job in the formal sector, you just end up in the informal sector because there's not a big social safety net. And you're going to be employed at lower wages in subsistence ag or something like that. So what's the effect on worker welfare of putting in minimum wages? Well, not everybody loses their job. I mean, a high enough minimum wage and they all will. But a lot of workers will lose their job compared to the numbers who keep. Because we have to understand the concept you were taught in your principles class, elasticities, which they probably did. Actually, I'm sure they did a great job here. This is like one of the topics that economists do the worst job of teaching students, because you all calculate your elasticity formulas and read it. Like, no one walks around the world doing this usually. Instead, you got to get the intuition of how price sensitivities matter for outcomes in analyzing policy. So if I'm thinking about whether a minimum wage helps worker welfare in a third world country, I need to know something about the price sensitivity of labor supply and labor demand. What do we think the labor supply price sensitivity is like in Vietnam, Bangladesh? What are your options? Not working and taking the generous social safety net? Oops, that don't exist. Oh, getting that visa to the United States. Sorry, if you're not educated and you're in a poorer country, there's virtually no legal path to immigration to the United States or somewhere else. So you basically have to supply labor to feed, clothe, shelter your family, or you cease to exist. Labor supply is very unprice sensitive. Meanwhile, what do we think labor demand from multinational firms is in Vietnam? Hyper price sensitive. They don't even own the factories there. All of a sudden the cost of labor in Vietnam goes up, next order from a different country. That simple. And for that matter, the capital that goes into the factories is also internationally mobile. Well, what's this mean? Mandate things like higher wages. Who can avoid it? The person who can avoid it is the multinationals. They avoid it by moving between companies like this, countries like this. What about the people? They're stuck there. So who ends up bearing the burden of this? The people in the poorer countries. So you get lots of unemployment, very little of them who keep their jobs at the higher wages. What happens to worker welfare overall? By most ways that we could plausibly come about measuring this, workers on net are going to be hurt in poorer countries when you mandate higher minimum wages for them. Not even counting economic inefficiencies of deadweight losses, just welfare of workers. And for that matter, when they get disemployed from the formal sector in garment industry, where do they end up? In the informal sector. Add more labor to that sector, what happens to the wages in the informal sector? That's going to go down too and hurt even poorer people that are in these countries. Some people will say, can't it just come out of the profits? They make huge profits. Well, one, no, actually most of these make normal rates of return adjusted for risk. But even if they did, because you'll see these calculations, Nike shoes, $150, cost of labor, $3. $147 in profit. No, that's not actually how it works. Otherwise we'd all be investing in Nike right now. But even if it were, Nike doesn't confront a choice of make shoes or not make shoes. They confront a choice of how to make shoes. How much labor should I use? How much labor from a poor country should I use? How much labor from a rich country should I use? How much capital should I use? And at whatever their current production is, they should be indifferent on the margin between these different ways of doing it. Which means when you change the price of doing it in one place, I respond by moving more of it somewhere else. So productivity adjusted cost of labor going into Nike should be equalized across countries. Same with people who make sport jackets and everything else. So mandating higher costs of labor in poorer countries is going to end up not moving those bounds, but just putting the price above the productivity bound of lots of people and pushing them back to the informal sector. We can also talk about labor standards, but before we do, let's talk about how these jobs compare to the alternatives. So a kind of famous case in the late 90s, Kathy Lee Gifford was confronted on TV by Charlie Kerrigan of the National Labor Committee, and he brought this girl, Wendy Diaz, in with him, who was a 15-year-old Honduran who was working for 31 cents an hour, or the equivalent of $967 a year. That translates into about $2.75 per day at that time. And she said, "You're exploiting this poor girl in the garment factory." And Kathy Lee cried on television, said, "I'm sorry, I'll change my ways." Chapter 4 of the book I just gave you is called "Don't Cry for Me, Kathy Lee." Because it turns out when you look at what that was, At that time, more than 15% of the population of Honduras was living on less than $1 a day. Nearly a third was living on $2 a day, or less. And as a 15-year-old, she was earning 37% above the national average. The job that was being protested as a sweatshop, while low by our standards, was a big step up for most of those people in that economy. So the very first project I did on this, and this was actually when Joe was at San Jose State, we were just talking about it. It was with a fellow student of his, Dave Scarbeck, who's a professor at Brown now. We said, let's set out and compare sweatshop wages to the alternatives. But like, while we can have that list of characteristics of bad working conditions, low wages, like, where's the dividing line of what makes it a sweatshop in a pejorative sense versus just manufacturing in a poorer country? There's no objective line on this. There's no nice, neat database of sweatshop wages you can download from the World Bank or anywhere else. So what Dave and I came up with, and what I did in the new edition of this book, is we said, we're just gonna scan English language news sources from around the world, and anything that protesters call a sweatshop that gets reported, and we got a wage for it, that's a sweatshop. If they think it's bad to protest it, bad enough to protest, it counts in our data. So we collected all of these, and the first edition of the book did it from 1995 through 2010. The new edition does it for this most recent decade, ending in 2019, because I didn't want 2020 stuff messing with the data. And this is a list of the ones which, there's many more reports in the news than this, but most of them are re-reporting the same thing over and over and over again. But for the list for this most recent decade, tons from Bangladesh, Cambodia, China, El Salvador, Haiti, India, Indonesia, Mauritius, Myanmar, Nicaragua, Pakistan, Philippines, Sri Lanka, and Vietnam. And while the wages that are reported are very low by our standards, we have to keep in mind that in these countries, poverty is widespread. So PPP means purchasing power parity adjusted. So we're going to adjust so $1 is $1 across countries. It buys you the same amount of stuff. And in these countries, significant chunks of the population live under $6.85 a day, under $3.65 a day, or under $2.15 per day. Bangladesh, which is the country that has the most sweatshops reported in recent decades, we're talking over the decade, 85% of the population lived under $6.85 a day. 50%, a little over 50% of the population under $3.65 a day. How do these sweatshop jobs compare to that? Well, we can do the same purchasing power parity adjustment and average the sweatshop wages reported in each country. And this is what we get. For almost all of them, except Bangladesh and India, they get over the $6 a day threshold. Some of them get significantly above that. Indonesia, Nicaragua are up over $16 a day, purchasing power parity adjusted. And Bangladesh, where it is the lowest, this is almost $6 a day, but 85% of the population was under $6.85 a day. These are relatively good paying jobs compared to the other alternatives that are available in these economies. The main alternative where lots of people come into this industry from is leaving agriculture, subsistence, in particular subsistence agriculture. So we can also look at compared to earnings in ag. Again, there's not a nice neat wage database for this, so we have to kind of back it out. And the blue lines tell you the amount of GDP per worker per day being created in ag. But that's obviously not their wages, that's just the amount of total output. So the orange line takes the share of income that labor gets in these countries and divides it by that. And that gets you an approximation of what your wage in ag is. And then the gray lines are those same sweatshop wages I just showed you. In almost all of these countries, not just the apparel industry or manufacturing in general, but the very ones being singled out as sweatshops in a pejorative sense, are paying significantly more on average than what the workers on average earn in ag. There's a reason why people are leaving the farms to go to the factories. We could also do it as a percent of GDP per capita. These show it for different number of hours worked, which 60, 70 hours, the longer hours, the more realistic ones. That's one of the characteristics of a sweatshop. There's some where we didn't have hourly data, we just had weekly or monthly data, so you don't have different estimates. And for most of these, for some, Cambodia, Haiti, Nicaragua, you see it exceeding average income even in the country. But for most of them, they're somewhere in that 60, 70% range of income, above average job. But this is what's being singled out in protest. A couple of the low ones that you see, like Mauritius, this is a weird one. It's a pretty wealthy nation, there's an island nation in the Indian Ocean. when you actually look about who's working in the sweatshops, it's immigrants from Sri Lanka, India, and Bangladesh. And if you take their earnings in the Mauritian sweatshop and compare it to per capita incomes in their origin countries, it's way over 100%. That's why they're moving there to work there. For China, it's not so much international migration as internal migration. Your inequalities within regions of China are huge. There's sweatshop workers moving to coastal regions to work in them from poor rural interior provinces where they're much poorer. All right. So we can't just mandate higher wages. The wages that they are paid are pretty good compared to what the realistic domestic alternatives are to them. But what about working conditions? I debated a labor rights activist at another university in Michigan. It wasn't Hillsdale, obviously. And she started her thing by saying, I'm not going to debate wages. I just think we have to mandate better working conditions. Which, good on her. She read some of my papers and knew she didn't want to argue with an economist about wages. But there's a problem. Wages and working conditions are linked. Students, how many of you have a part-time job here? Let's pick on you. What's your part-time job?
Athletics.
Athletics?
Yeah.
What do you do?
It was like event planning and parking tickets.
Event planning and parking tickets. Okay, what about you?
I work in admissions building, so giving tours to prospective families.
Giving tours to families. All right. Well, I'll play the hand you guys dealt me. So, whatever wage they give you in athletics or in admissions, let's say they increased it 50%, but what'd you say for athletics? What do you do?
I work parking and tickets.
Parking. All right. So that in parking, you had to wear a very heavy outfit that would make you very hot in the Florida sun, and it was camouflaged to match the parking spaces so that your job would become more dangerous, but you get paid 50% more. Would this make you happy or unhappy?
Very unhappy.
Very unhappy. I didn't really care which way you picked. The point is, you as an employee have a preference over the mix of your wages and your working conditions. Now, if I didn't make the suit that hot or that well camouflaged and gave you 100% raise, maybe you'd choose, I'd rather have the pay. But the point is, you care about your mix of compensation. You won the sweatshop game at $2 a day. If you have to pay me $2 a day to work, do you care whether you pay me $2 in cash or $1.50 in cash and 50 cents in other benefits? Why do you care?
I'd be making more real profit if I just paid you the $1.50.
No, the 50 cents, you also have to pay me that, just in better hours, vacation time, whatever. You're still paying me $2. So $2 is $2, right?
Yeah.
You don't really care. It's just a cost. I mean, to some extent, you want a little safety, like if I'm lopping off a finger every third shoe, I'm not going to stitch many shoes. But other than that, other than productivity adjusted, cost is a cost is a cost is a cost, right? Okay, well that means when outsiders say, we want to change the working conditions in sweatshops to make them better for the worker, they're not saying we're changing the preferences of the evil corporation. What they're saying is, we want to reverse the preferences of the worker and make it fit my first world sensibilities of how nice your job should be, and you can get paid less as a result. Because a profit maximizing employer, and everybody agrees these are greedy profit maximizing firms, has every incentive to tailor the mix of compensation of its workers towards the average preferences. Otherwise, they're leaving money on the table. They're paying $2 for something an employee values at $1.90. You can remix that package, save yourself money, and still get the workers. This, by the way, is like standard core microeconomic theory. When I said this debating the labor activist, she's like, well, that's just economic theory. And I'm like, yeah, but it's micro, not macro. This is the nonfiction part of the discipline. And we all know it. Why do garbage men get paid so much relative to their education and skills? Because the job's dangerous and unpleasant. So you have to compensate for that. Why do musicians in town here playing live shows get paid so little? Because they get to play music and it's their hobby and other people watch them. And if they're single, they probably get to go home with someone at the end of the night. You don't have to pay them very much money to get them to do it. This is compensating differentials. So put yourself in the position of a poor sweatshop worker. Your total compensation is really low. How do you think you want the vast majority of that meager compensation? Money. You're trying to feed, clothe, shelter your family. All those other things are what economists would call normal goods. The health, safety, as your total compensation goes up, as that upper bound of productivity goes up, you're going to want more of your compensation in that form. But at very low levels, you're not. So, since she said this was just economic theory, I was like, well, let's do a study on it and actually ask workers. So in Guatemala, Sambridge and Nicotex were two firms singled out by the National Labor Committee, and they had a long list of complaints, including inadequate pay, long hours, poor working conditions. They weren't enrolling their employees in the state mandated healthcare system. They were only enrolling like 20% of them at a time. So like when you were enrolled, you could go for your annual checkup, but don't break a leg on the other part of the time. They weren't giving mandated vacation time. They were being verbally abusive. And the National Labor Committee went and asked these workers, would you like more pleasant working conditions? Would you like health insurance? What do you think the workers said? Let me try this. Joe Connors is a tenured professor. He's got one of the cushiest jobs in the world. Joe, would you like a bigger office?
Yes, I would.
Would
Like a lazy river.
We have one of those at Texas Tech. We actually had one of the nation's first lazy rivers. It's great. And it's not very lazy, it's fast. But an unconstrained question, even from someone who has one of the cushiest jobs in the world, is not very informative. If I said, Joe, would you take 10% less pay for a 50% bigger office? No. Now we've got preference. That's a constrained one. So National Labor Committee asked poor workers, would you like health insurance? Yeah. Would you like vacation? Yeah. We're like, well, why don't we ask them the constrained one, which is, would you be willing to work for less money if your employer changed these various conditions? And there was a follow-up question, if so, can we check exotics? Turns out that this follow-up question wasn't really relevant. And by the way, this picture's inside Sam Bridge. The sweat stain under my armpit was not related to the factory's ventilation. It was actually air conditioning there. There was a student from the local university who drove me there. His car wasn't air conditioned on the way there. Caused that. It's in the picture. But the way we did this was without the company's knowledge or permission. We surveyed the workers as they got off the bus before or after work. And I kind of stand out in Guatemala, and I don't speak Spanish well enough to actually interview people. So we hired a local firm to do this for us. That was on a follow-up visit when I got in the factory afterwards. Well, we asked them a whole bunch of things, but for our purposes here today, would you be willing to work for lower pay if your employer reduced the number of hours you had to work, made them more predictable, gave you bathroom breaks, gave you longer lunch breaks, made your conditions more pleasant, made them safer, provided health insurance, gave you paid vacation, treated you more fairly, and reduced the risk of sexual harassment? With the exception of that last question, all of these things were things that the National Labor Committee alleged were problems there. If we look at the total column where you combine the two of these, what do you see? No. Paid vacation, 81% of people said no. That was the one that got the most people who were interested in it. This tells you, conditional on what total compensation is, the mix largely reflects employee preferences, which is exactly what economic theory would predict. All right. New edition of the book has this, first edition didn't. When I used to give this talk, people would then say, all right, so fine, that's true for normal working condition things. But there was this disaster in Bangladesh in 2013. A factory collapsed at Rana Plaza. 1,129 people died. Another 2,500 were injured. Clearly, Bangladesh should have working condition laws for factory safety to prevent disasters like this. For those people, it was not their least bad job. Definitely true. But that tells us nothing more than if we had a house fire next door here and somebody died, and someone said, therefore we should all go back to dwelling in caves because it's risky to live in houses. Well, it's tragic what happened to these particular workers. Knowing ex post what happened to them versus ex ante what we can predict. When there were 4 million garment workers in Bangladesh, some factory will have a disaster on some day, and we don't know which one it is. On this particular day, including the factory owner, so there was a crack that developed in the factory before the collapse happened. They were evacuated. They were told it was safe to go back in. They went back in. It collapsed. These people lost their lives. The factory owner went to jail for a while. If he had known with certainty that this was happening, he would have been better off saying, don't do this. The point is, ex ante, we don't know which factory is going to have a disaster which day. So any factory safety standards we put in place apply to all the factories and all 4 million workers, not just the ones who are unlucky in what is the worst modern disaster in the garment industry. So Bangladesh, actually Bangladesh government really doesn't do shit. So it really didn't do much to respond to this either in terms of safety standards. But multinational brands who are concerned with their image did. So the multinational brands got together and they created two things, the Accord and the Alliance, depending which companies they were. And they said, we're gonna have independent auditors, we're gonna set structural and fire safety standards and other safety standards. And for any of us that are gonna source garments from Bangladesh, will only do so from factories that are certified by either the Alliance or the Accord. Then they have an anonymous tip line. When factories go out of compliance, then we will say either fix it to this standard or we boycott you. So it's an international buyer enforced boycott who are concerned with their own brand images. And it has teeth. So since that happened, not one of these disasters has happened on this scale again. And they have ordered boycotts of numerous firms. Hundreds of petitions have been shown to improve safety. Well, economics is trade-offs. So what's the trade-off on that? So I did a study with actually a classmate of Vincent's who's from Bangladesh, and we compare it to the counterfactual and say what was happening to growth in jobs in the garment industry before and after we put these safety standards into effect. Well, what we find is there's about 28% fewer jobs created in the garment industry in the 4 years following this. That translates into over 1 million jobs. The sweatshop jobs that were protested in Bangladesh in that decade paid on average $5.81 a day. 51% of the population was living under $3.65 a day. What's the trade-off involved here? Even if we grant that the worst disaster in modern history in the garment industry would have happened again, is 1,100 lives lost? How do you weight that against 1 million people escaping extreme poverty? How do you weight that against the fact that this is also like 80% of their exports, 13% of GDP, and is part of the process of development, raising standards overall, particularly if you care about like rural women because they're the ones escaping poverty doing this. Economics can't tell you good or bad. Economics can tell you trade-offs. And what I'd say is the increased safety standards, the trade-off is 1 million people being stuck in poverty who would have got out otherwise. And now you have to do your own value judgments, but I think it's fairly reasonable to say maybe not worth it. Yeah?
Is the cost of labor already not low enough so that the companies don't need to lower the wages while also simultaneously improving the safety conditions? So like, aren't they making such a margin already that to spend some more money to make it safer doesn't actually cut into it as much as the wages? They don't need to lower the wages. They're just choosing to do it.
No. So the equilibrium level of employment in Bangladesh right now leaves garment industry buyers indifferent on the margin between ordering from Bangladesh, Vietnam, or Canada. If they're not indifferent between these, they need to reallocate their orders immediately. So what happens is when you change, so basically, why is it so low? It's because productivity is so low in Bangladesh. And through no fault of the worker, it's the institutional environment in which they live makes it really hard to create value for the company the same way. Whereas if you're in the United States or Canada, that same worker has a lot more capital, technology. You don't have to worry about corrupt officials and inflation rates the same way. They're way more productive. So productivity adjusted cost of labor in both need to be equalized. Otherwise you should reallocate your orders. So when we change the cost in one place, we change the amount of employment, which is exactly, when we empirically measure this, what we find. We get 1 million less jobs in Bangladesh when we mandate higher safety standards. Yeah?
Isn't there an incentive for the factory owners themselves to keep up the safety protocols without the need of the Alliance or the Accords? Because it's a lot more expensive to replace a factory than it is to just fix the crack behind it.
Yes, but all of these decisions are on the margin. So there is some incentive of safety for the factory, because if your factory falls down, you're not making stuff. But how much safety should you do? And what's happening with the Alliance and the Accord is they're pushing it beyond what the profit maximizing level of safety for the owners and the workers would be. And as a result, that costs jobs. It's a good question, but that's All of these things, all of this stuff is all on the margin. That's actually partly the answer to your question, partly the answer to yours. What about the kids? Save the children, right? We've got to be at least against child labor. Well, children don't work because their parents are dumb or evil. They work because they're desperately trying to feed, clothe, and shelter their family. And without the child's meager income, they can't get by. As their incomes goes up, child labor disappears. But when we ban products made with child labor, we don't get rid of their poverty. We get rid of their least bad way of dealing with their poverty. So when we interact with child labor from the third world, it's mostly through imported manufactured goods. So if we put bans on bringing in products with child labor, we have to ask, what do the children do then? They don't just leave the factory and go to school. Where do most children in the third world work? Agriculture, particularly subsistence ag. This is in Guatemala when I was down there one of the times. For the countries that have sweatshops and where we can get child labor data, the blue line of the children working, the percent who work in ag, that's where most of them work. Orange is services, mostly household services, domestic stuff. Gray is the manufacturing. That's where a minority of the children work. Most of the children work in the other two industries. So when we ban products made with child labor, we move children out of working in manufacturing, but they still have poverty, so where do they work? The other two sectors. Which one of these three sectors do you think on average pays the best? Manufacturing. When it comes to child injury rates, injury in ag in third world countries, way higher than injury in manufacturing. So we end up pushing children into more dangerous, less remunerative jobs, and in fact, places where they build less human capital as well. The real cure for child labor is the process of development. As incomes go up, families pull kids out of workforce. This here breaks up countries by fifths. In the poorest fifth of countries, a third of kids work. Once you get up to the top 40%, virtually none of them do. This understates it because you can even look within a poor country. Best study I've seen on this tracks individual families for Vietnam, and there's not like some linear relationship. It's like big drops. Basically, it was around 1,800 or 2,100 calories. Once a family could afford that many calories, boom, drop in child labor. Then it was around Vietnam's official poverty threshold. Boom, another drop in that family having their kids in the workforce. Basically, can we feed everybody? Can we feed and clothe everybody? Once we can do these things, kids leave labor force. Now, richer countries also have laws against child labor, but poor countries do too, they just don't enforce them. But right here, that's about $11,000 per capita. When we look when the United States put in our first national child labor law, it was 1938. In today's dollars, it's about $10,000 per capita. When did the United States outlaw child labor? Basically when we hit a level of development where children weren't working. Now, individual states had anti-child labor laws before this. My home state of Massachusetts originally was the first in the United States in the 1840s. Here's what the law against child labor there said. Children under 12 can't work more than 10 hours per day in a factory. 12 and over, whatever goes. Everybody else, you're limited to about 60 hours per week when you're a kid. Other states passed similar laws, and actually when economic historians study mandatory school attendance laws and anti-child labor laws passed throughout the progressive era, what they find is once you control for economic growth, these laws have very little effect. So basically what's happening, as we have economic growth, kids leave labor force, what happens, we pass laws that codify kids not being in labor force. We don't stick the laws in before we get to that level of development. So let me finish up a little bit with the ultimate cure for these. Sweatshops are not new. We had them in the United States, in Great Britain. In fact, I can think of no country that's rich today that didn't go through something like a sweatshop stage of economic development. My hometown of Haverhill, Massachusetts was known as the Shoe City. It was the leading producer of women's shoes in the 19th century. My great-grandmother worked in the Cardinal Shoe Factory down the river in Lawrence, Massachusetts. It would be considered a sweatshop today. What happened? In the United States, in Great Britain, this process of development, the proximate causes of higher productivity, more physical capital, more technology, more human capital, these are things the factories bring with them compared to what was there before. Now they need the underlying factors for economic development private property rights, a large measure of economic freedom, and a tolerable degree of the rule of law. But put those things in place, these proximate causes flow in, and development occurs, productivity goes up. As productivity goes up, not just wages, but other forms of compensation go up. In the United States and Great Britain, that's about a 150-year process. The United States, from pre-industrial to post-sweatshop, is more like 100 years maybe. Why is it quicker in the United States than Great Britain? Where did the United States get the technology for the Industrial Revolution? Stole it from Great Britain to start with. Where did we get some of the physical capital, the investment part? From Great Britain. What are the countries that were sweatshop countries circa 1960? Taiwan, South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore. What happened with them? It's not a 100-year process, it was about a generation. By 1980, most of them were first world countries. Those were places that embraced economic freedom, property rights, free trade, and the capital and the technology flew in and did it faster. The same process is playing out in sweatshop countries today. And in fact, one of the things I thought was cool that I got to do in the new version of the book was the same process I wrote about over a decade ago. Let's look at those countries and see what's happened from the first edition of the book to now for poverty rates in these countries and child labor rates. I do a whole bunch of them in the book, a few of them here. And what are you seeing? This is at the 365 a day standard. You can do it with the other ones. See big reductions in poverty as this process is playing out quickly in these countries today. And for the ones where sweatshops are reported in both the first edition and the second edition, we can look and see what's happened to sweatshop wages. The things that we're singling out for protest pay more today than they did 15 years ago. What's happened is we've redefined what a bad job is in a pejorative term to match the economic growth that's happening in these countries. Now, I do think there's some things that on the margin can be done to help workers, other than, like, the big one is this process of economic development. By the way, these students in the room, you're used to hearing like doom and gloom stuff about what's going on in the world. Like, you're all what, 20 to 22 years old, right? Basically, your lifetime has been the biggest poverty reduction in sheer numbers in human history. Somehow this doesn't make it onto the news, but of people escaping extreme poverty that under those type of standards that I've talked about, in China and India alone, dwarf any other 20-year period in world history. That's what's been going on. So that's the big cure for this, and it's playing out right now. You just have to pay attention to it. Now, that doesn't mean that there's other things we couldn't do on the margin. So maybe ethical branding, some role for this. So why do we buy Nikes? Why does Nike pay Michael Jordan millions and millions of dollars? It's not for him stitching shoes. It's because y'all want to be like Mike, right? That's the marketing part, is it creates subjective value in your head that makes you more willing to pay for the product. Well, what if we did air sweatshops? And we told you that we're going to pay these workers a little bit more than what they would otherwise make and have a living wage. And if you value that more, just for the same reason that you value Michael Jordan more, what just happened to their upper bound? It just went up. Their physical productivity is the same, but the value they create, because it's actually tied to them, goes up in your mind. You pay more for the product, they can earn it. There's a way to do this. By the way, I didn't do that. So presumably whoever did that, we're limited in the number of characters they have. So that is something, but we have to be really careful, because like fair trade coffee, there's a lot of fraud. So it's people who want to feel good about their purchases, signal to their friends how social justice-y or whatever they are, but don't check on this. So there's something called Shop with a Conscious Consumer Guide. They guarantee that all of the products sold on this website are made in factories that are sweat-free, pay a living wage, have the right to unionize, and have good working conditions. Here's a map of their source factories. It's a buy made in the USA campaign, and it's like, are they lying? No, it's literally true. But if you do this in the guise of we're helping poor workers, no, mostly you're avoiding buying from poor workers and just having US workers give you stuff. So I also think you can do a better job of targeting slave labor. When I did the first edition of this book, I could say that slave labor was exceedingly rare in the garment industry. That's not quite true today anymore, because there's one major exception to it, the Uyghur province in China. So there the government uses the threat of violence to force people to work in factories and in fields with cotton that becomes part of the production supply chain of various garments. They also work in garment factories there. if you're using the threat of violence to make workers work, it is not your least bad option. Drying up the demand for that labor makes those workers better off. So instead of just protesting sweatshops in general, have trade sanctions and boycotts that target the actual slave labor that does exist in the world, and don't confuse these issues. Other things on the margin that you can do, more free trade, lower our tariffs with them. When the good comes into the United States, if it gets taxed, that lowers the upper bound of the workers because they create less revenue for the firm. Moving towards free trade raises that bound. You really want to help them, become a pro-immigration advocate. So when a Haitian who works in a Haitian sweatshop moves to the United States, on average their income goes up by 1,000%. For a Mexican, it's 150%. Other Latin American countries, it's somewhere in between those two ranges. And that's not like playing out over a generation or 10 years. That's like almost tomorrow. Why is the labor supply so inelastic in these countries? Because no one's offering them a visa to the United States. If you're thinking about working on the farm or the sweatshop, and then you're offered a visa to work in the United States, your lower bound just jumped way up over what your productivity in your origin country is, and that's why you move. That's a good way to help them. Ultimately, some of these countries need institutional reform, better rule of law, property rights, economic freedom. I think this is really hard to do from the outside. It has to be homegrown. But as a first step, I'd say, do no harm. And I think much of what the anti-sweatshop activists have argued for, if implemented, would do harm. And ceasing to do that would be a better step in the right direction for these workers. And I will conclude with that and take any final questions that you might have. You're first because I know you were patient and waiting, but I was winding up to try to get it done.
Can you go back to the slide that showed different sectors that children work in based on the country?
Yep.
Yeah, I know you said that manufacturing is the highest paid job between the two of them.
Mm-hmm.
Why is there not more children working in that industry if they're higher paid?
So the children are more productive in that industry, but there's not the availability of jobs. They're competing against adults who are more productive than them also in those industries. So the children are getting funneled into the jobs that adults don't outcompete them in, and more of them end up getting funneled into these less productive, because they have less human capital, right? So the lower productivity sectors that require less human capital, you're gonna get more of the kids. It's like the kids who are exceeding, this is a weird thing to say, but it's like the successful kids exceeding the norm are the ones who are making it into the manufacturing. But good question. Yeah?
Have you studied any of like the direct correlation between tariffs and let's say like the number of jobs lost because of them? Sweatshops?
Yeah, not sweatshops specifically, but dude, this is a crazy time in the United States right now with tariffs. And people say all sorts of absurd stuff, including like the 3 economists who don't understand international trade who happen to work at the Trump White House. But jobs are really not affected by tariffs, a number of jobs. Whether we mean for us in the United States or for them in their country, the number one thing that determines the number of jobs in your country is the size of the labor force. That's the number one fact. Next after that is labor market regulation that gets in the way of employers and would-be employees negotiating to work together. Tariffs change the mix of jobs in the economy, but not the whole number. And in fact, I think economists, so most of you all raised your hand that you took a principles class, economists need to do a better job of talking about this, not as like, oh yeah, job loss in some industry, manufacturing as a part of the consequences of trade. No, listen. When we say there's gains from international trade through comparative advantage, that requires job loss. Like we only get those gains by destroying jobs in the industries where foreigners have a lower cost of doing it than us, and creating jobs where we have a comparative, like the whole argument of comparative advantages is about churning your mix of jobs. You don't get the gains in productivity without churning the mix. It's not like a side effect that, oh, this is the negative part of this. No, this is part and parcel of it. But total number of jobs doesn't change. The mix of jobs is mostly what changes. Yeah?
So, like, the last one example, we developed more and started getting, like, a computer, and all the people who did math by hand didn't lose their, like, they lost their job as doing that, but they moved into a different industry.
Great point. So trade is just like a production technology. So when technology advances, we get rid of some jobs, we create new jobs, and we move to a higher standard of living. trade is nothing other than a different production technology. So like imagine, I live in Lubbock, Texas, so like how should we make cars in the United States? We can make them the way we all know that they make them in Vince's home state of Michigan on an assembly line. But what if there was this new technology and we just took cotton that we grew in Lubbock, we stuck it in a metal box, we kicked it off the shore in Oakland, we wait like 2 months and it's a magic box, and it turns around and spits out cars. We call them Toyotas, which is the way that we should make cars. Answer is, on the margin, whichever is cheapest adjusted for quality, they're both just technologies for making cars. So growing cotton and trading with some Japanese people is just the same as a technology to make cars as building an assembly line. And when we have advances in trade, it's not unlike the assembly line of Henry Ford changing how we make cars. And it's going to change our mix of jobs. But this talk about manufactured job loss is mostly because of manufacturing's productivity increase relative to services in the United States, not about international trade. But even if it were, like, do we really want the sweatshop jobs back? Let's get those China jobs back in America. Forget these high-skill things that we're doing here. No, we need to go back to sweatshops. It's crazy. Yeah.
So you hear a lot about like, you know, foreign aid and like charity work to, you know, kind of like educate children in third world countries, right? You know, build their human capital, you might say, right?
Mm-hmm.
Would it just be, do you think we should like set that aside and maybe just buy more like, I don't know, cheap clothes off of like Temu or something like that to help the kids rather than like investing in that? Like, what do you think should come first? Like the educating the kids or, you know, like employing them so they get to that point where they can go to school? What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, because we have a very conceited notion of education in the United States that it involves something like this. But like on-the-job practical training is a form of human capital formation. And it could be that that's the more valuable form of human capital formation for younger people in some of these poorer countries. It's certainly the case that compared to their government schools that often teach just indoctrination rather than actual skills, that it could be better. But I do think, so on the margin of other things we could do, we have plenty of church groups that do missionary work of education in poorer countries. The main reason children work is they need the money. So if you wanted to get more kids in school and out of factories, having missionary schools where you also pay them to come to school would get them out of factories. I think that would be an effective way to do it that doesn't jeopardize what's going on in their economy otherwise, and lowers child labor on the margin and teaching. And as long as it's beneficial for them to get that education and pay, they'll choose to do so. And we don't risk the type of things of, well, if they were really better off in the factory, they'd still choose that. But I think that's the missionary work on that, I think is interesting. Yeah?
What is the age range associated with analyzing child labor? Like, what's the oldest until they're considered like homework?
Oh, good question, because the dates changed from the first time I did this book to the new time. I think it's 14 and under is mostly what I was told. And it depends whether you're in World Bank or ILO. It was either 14 or 8 to 14 or 8 to 12, depending. I can't remember.
Do different countries have like different regulations? Like, how is the data kind of like comparable if what being a child is very similar?
So that's where the key. So the data that I'm using is consistent across countries, measured by the same ages by international organizations. But the anti-child labor laws themselves differ by country and what they define as the ages. Yeah.
How much of a role does competition play in these places? Like, do regions that have more sweatshops typically have higher wages or better living conditions, or does that play a factor?
Yes, they tend to be places that pay more and they have net in-migration. But I think the general point here, and this is a good one, maybe we'll end on this, is like when we're talking about like the upper and lower bounds, and I said a lot of this is about upper bound productivity, it's also the case that we don't want one buyer. We want lots of factories competing so that it's not subsistence ag or the factory, it's working in one factory versus the another, and then you get your wages up near the top. And a lot of these things are in export processing zones where there's lots of factories and stuff next to them. That tends to be the norm. But in cases where there is a monopsony of a single buyer, part of the answer is more factories. And I think that ends my time here. Thank you all for your questions. I'll be happy to chat with some people afterwards if you want, but thank you all for having me.